Hello. Before the vaults of the Black Library opened, the keepers of Games Workshop fiction took a very different form. Stories were mostly told in short bursts in rulebooks and pages of White Dwarf. But in the late 80s, there would be an attempt to change all of that, with the creation of a dedicated publisher for Warhammer fiction. The experiment would only last for 3 years, but during that time, we would see some of the greatest stories ever told in the worlds of Warhammer. Prepare yourself for macabre fantasy in a grim world of perilous adventure. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're reading the history of GW books. "1989 was a good year to be a Warhammer fan. The 3rd edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles and Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader were beginning to shape the realities of their respective universes into something more formal that we might vaguely recognise today. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was going from strength to strength, so much so that Games Workshop was establishing a dedicated publisher to manage development and design for new supplements. Andy Jones was even scouting new bands to sign to a Warhammer record label. Games Workshop itself had been shifting away from selling third-party products to producing and distributing its own games exclusively, and there was a desire within the company to create new stories set within the core worlds of its games: Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer 40,000, and Dark Future. A new line of novels was going to be produced. After this new range of fiction was announced in White Dwarf 117, the pitch was compelling. Each book will take you further into these worlds of macabre fantasy and futuristic horror, with epic adventures, heroic warriors, and dark wizards, skilled ops, crazed renegades, psychers, inquisitors, marines, and the ever-present terror of chaos. Before we turn to the first chapter of this literary history, don't forget though that you can like this video, if you like this video, and you can also subscribe to the channel. We are almost at 10,000 subs and I'm very excited about hitting that milestone. And if you are interested in visiting or indeed revisiting the grim fantasy and perilous adventure of the Warhammer books, stick around to the end of the video for some exciting news. In some ways, you could consider TSR to be an American counterpart to Games Workshop. Both companies were established roughly around the same time. Both revolutionised their respective hobby markets, and both sold games that were filled to the brim with dragons and/or dungeons. And though they would develop in very different ways, there were definitely many examples of inspiration drawn one way or the other. In the mid-80s, TSR had begun publishing fantasy fiction tied to its D&D settings. A notable mega success in this respect was the Dragonlance Chronicles series written by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. First published in 1984, this series had turned into a sprawling epic composed of multiple best-selling sequels. And all that was despite Dave Langford's review in White Dwarf, which described it as deadly predictable questing that he couldn't even finish. As Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay had started to add colour to the broad strokes of the setting that had emerged in the Wargames 3rd edition, it had become clear that the Warhammer world was a broad canvas desperately in need of paint. The various books released so far had done excellent work in telling stories about the history, races, locations, and occasional characters of the setting, but there seemed to be an audience that might want more detailed and immersive stories, and if Dragonlance had proved anything, it was that fantasy fans would buy books. To that end, Brian Ansell approached Richard Evans, an editor at McDonald & Co., to see if he could recommend a prime fantasy author who might be able to develop a story based on the Warhammer IP. Mike Scott Rohan was the best-selling author in the McDonald stable at that time, so naturally Evans put Brian Ansell in touch with him directly. Rohan had written a book called Run to the Stars, a science fiction adventure that White Dwarf's reviewer Dave Langford had described as a superior sci-fi adventure, despite relying on a truly mind-boggling coincidence at the climax. In Imagine magazine, reviewer David Pringle said that the book is all done with marvellous bravura, and that the narrative fairly crackles with energy. Banzai Arigato. Rohan's most popular series, The Winter of the World, even seems to feature art from GW legend Ian Miller on some of its covers. Rohan and occasional writing partner Alan Scott signed up to the project, According to Rohan, we were offered pretty good sums and signed up. We had no qualms about it because we felt we had plenty of scope for being creative. For better or worse, they worked up a pitch which operated within the constraints of the Warhammer world, but which pretty studiously avoided interacting with any established character in the game. At least one GW executive struggled with this new type of relationship that they had to manage though, one with professional authors. Rohan recalled, one executive made it clear he wasn't interested in quality and indeed didn't believe it was possible in anything like fantasy fiction. We decided the book could only be written in a wholly unserious, picaresque vein, and even included outrageous caricatures of each other among the main characters, and of certain GW jerks as the villains. Curiously, this synopsis was approved, and things seemed to be on track for the first GW book. But then legal questions arose. There was some concern over potential infringement of Tolkien copyrights, as well as question marks around rights for foreign distribution. Eventually, after a period of legal impasse, GW decided to abandon the book project, cancelling the contract and pulling the plug. Ultimately, Rohan and Scott would expunge the Warhammer references and release the book anyway, via the McDonald imprint Orbit, under a new title, A Spell of Empire. The book featured a reimagined Europe under the Nibelung Empire, and told the story of a magician called Volker recruiting 3 would-be musketeers, whose motto was all for one, and each for himself. It actually sounds pretty fun. In time, the leadership at Games Workshop would decide to try again, but this time they would look closer to home for a pilot to help them navigate these uncharted waters. David Langford had been reviewing books in the pages of White Dwarf since 1983's issue 39. In describing Langford's recruitment, author Stephen Baxter has said he was the greasy hub at the heart of the rickety wheel that is British sci-fi, and so was a good choice for the job. In January 1987, Langford issued a series of letters to potential authors that he thought might be suitable for the GW project. The intention was to secure enough established names that they could then approach Penguin with a full package deal, and Penguin could publish the books on Games Workshop's behalf. Written with Langford's unique sense of humour and, dare I say, snobbishness, the letters explained that he had a sleazy proposition about a world in which a god of death called Mor suggests intermittent study of etymology, and a god of disease called Nurgle sounds more like the Goon Show. Regarding payment, Langford quoted management as saying it would be the usual rates plus maybe the odd percentage point, based on this having a greater sales potential than usual. A total of 12 letters were sent out with mixed responses. According to Langford, 7 authors told him to piss off. One such response came from Chris Evans, author of 1981's science fiction horror The Insider, who described the Warhammer world as a wholly derivative mishmash, which offers precious little imaginative scope. Instead, he opted to write the somehow less derivative tie-in novelization of the movie Inner Space. John Bruner, Rob Holdstock, Tanith Lee, and Lisa Tuttle were all no's as well, along with up-and-coming sci-fi firebrand Ian Watson. Interestingly, it seems that Langford counted himself amongst the authors who turned down the offer, saying, "I doubt I could write that flavour of fantasy without my tongue visibly in my cheek." Though that's not clear if he sent himself one of the 12 letters and then returned a rejection to himself. One of the authors who did accept the premise of the offer was Brian Stableford, and he would actually stay involved a lot longer than many of the others. Another author who said yes was Gary Kilworth. A former Royal Navy cryptographer, Kilworth had already amassed an eclectic bibliography in historical and fantastic fiction, but his acceptance was less about the magic of the opportunity and more about the practical reality. In his response to Langford, he said, "Your letter arrived on the same day as my bank statement." The third author who was willing to accept the call was none other than Terry Pratchett. What a delightful world with many original touches. In Robert Robinson's telling phrase, it looks as though the writers learned the language in a hurry in order to sell beads to the natives. But provided no one expects me to take it as seriously as it clearly takes itself, count me in as interested, at least as far as knowing what the usual rates in this case are. He later said, "I feel a bit like King Herod being invited to write the newsletter for the Bethlehem Playground Association." Alas, this effort to establish Warhammer Books would meet with failure as well. The contracts that were offered to the authors who had accepted the initial inquiry letters were deemed unacceptable by all. The plan for David Langford to assemble a dirty dozen of macabre fantasists that could be pitched to Penguin was scrapped. Games Workshop's unfamiliarity with the traditional book publishing business seems to have been the key driver behind the failure, as well as their inability or unwillingness to pay reasonable rates to their authors. But it's hard not to note that the derisive snobbishness of the British sci-fi establishment also seems to have been a pretty important factor as well. David Langford, returning to reviews, would later write in his largely positive Drachenfels review, "Owing to misgivings, I've delayed dipping into Games Workshop's books based on, or set in the world of, or generally tainted by, their Warhammer games. Long ago, I was invited to contribute, but after reading the source books, I just couldn't. Perhaps the game plays brilliantly, but its literary background is just basic junk food fantasy and desperately derivative. To be honest, I think we got lucky." Brian Ansell's desire to have professional authors write fiction set within the worlds of Warhammer was far from over though. In fact, Ian Watson, the author who had already declined an offer of work from David Langford, has since said, "Ansell yearned to read real novels by real novelists set in his beloved domains." So it's perhaps unsurprising that in 1998, a third attempt to establish a Games Workshop fiction line would be undertaken, except this time, it would work. For a bit. The plan was simple. This time, Games Workshop would publish the books themselves. They had already established Flame Publications, an RPG company that was comprised of just 3 people. So why couldn't they do the same with fiction books as well? Except this time, it would be just 2 people. David Pringle was recruited to be the editor, and Ian Miller was recruited to be the art editor. This new subsidiary would be called GW Books, and it would have a remit to produce fiction for the 3 core games that Games Workshop was producing: Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer 40,000, and Dark Future. David Pringle had been the editor of literary magazine Interzone for the past 6 years, having co-founded it in 1982 with a collective of other writers and critics. Initially releasing on a quarterly basis, the magazine had built a strong following, publishing new fiction from rising and established authors, and by 1988, it would be releasing on a bi-monthly schedule. Over the years, the magazine has published stories by a nigh unbeatable cohort of science fiction legends, including Brian Aldiss, J.G. Ballard, Ian M. Banks, Stephen Baxter, Greg Egan, William Gibson, Robert Holtstock, Gwyneth Jones, Terry Pratchett, Christopher Priest, Alistair Reynolds, and Charles Stross. With Pringle in the editor's chair at GW Books, the expectation was that he would be able to bring some of the Interzone generation to the Warhammer writing desk. And he did. After fighting hard and securing Brian Ansell's commitment that authors would be well compensated for their work, David Pringle was finally able to offer something that his predecessors couldn't: a good contract. Authors working for GW Books would receive a minimum payment of £10,000 in royalties for a full volume, and for a short of 7,000 words or more, they would receive £1,000 minimum. There was one catch though. GW Books would retain all of the rights to the stories and the characters that the authors created. Brian Stableford, the author who had previously accepted David Langford's offer to work for Games Workshop, had stayed on and helped to write the contracts with David Pringle. He would finally get to produce actual fiction for Games Workshop, and he was joined by Interzone authors like Kim Newman and Stephen Baxter. They would all be put to work creating short stories set in the world of Warhammer Fantasy. David Pringle wanted them to start with short stories in an anthology that he could then use to test their ability to write fiction in this world, before he commissioned a full-length novel. The first anthology of stories would be named Ignorant Armies, after the short story by Kim Newman about a chaotic battleground of near-infinite warfare. Many of the authors in the volume had chosen to publish under pseudonyms. Brian Stableford wrote as Brian Craig, Charles Stross as Charles Davidson, and Paul Macaulay wrote under the name Sean Flynn. Even Kim Newman, who was building a name for himself as a film critic in Empire magazine, used a nom de plume, Jack Yeovil, recalling that everyone else on the line was using a pseudonym, so I did too. Some authors chose to use their real names though, with additional stories in Ignorant Armies from Nicola Griffith, William King, and Stephen Baxter. Johann parried a blow and felt its force ringing throughout his entire body. His opponent was a foot taller and heavily armoured, but its reactions were slower, and its helmet was distorted by a head that seemed to have expanded inside it. It was a mutant of some sort, a human being under the influence of the Warpstone, turning into the physical image of whatever dark desires or fears it had harboured. As art editor, Ian Miller commissioned several familiar GW illustrators to fill these volumes with beautiful art. Ignorant Armies included a frontispiece by John Blanche and internal illustrations by Jim Burns, Ian McCaig, Martin McKenna, Bob Naismith, John Sibick, Adrian Smith, Steve Tappin, and even a colour map by Jez Goodwin that could also be found in HeroQuest's Return of the Witchlord. The initial batch of full-length novels would be commissioned from authors who were in this short story set, the first of which was Drachenfels by Jack Yeovil. The story opened with the end of an epic quest by an adventuring party that had finally come face to face with their ultimate enemy, the great enchanter Constant Drachenfels. The rest of the story would take place 25 years after they defeated him, and dealt with the attempts to stage a play for Emperor Karl Franz in the abandoned Drachenfels castle. The book was well received, and even collected high praise from reviewer John Clute in Interzone, who said, "The whole plot manages to acknowledge its relationship to the owned world, while at the same time asserting a final freedom." It seemed the literary establishment was still not sold on the idea that a book written within a corporation's owned world could be worthwhile. For what it's worth, I thought it was really good. Other books followed, such as the first novel from Brian Craig, Zaragoz, part 1 of a proposed trilogy about the struggle of good against the dark powers of chaos, as retold by the minstrel Orfeo. Then came Wolf Riders, a second anthology of Warhammer Fantasy stories, again including shorts from William King, Jack Yeovil, and Brian Craig, with new authors Sandy Mitchell, Ralph T. Castle, Pete Garrett, and Simon Ounsley also providing stories. There was a huge push across Games Workshop to promote the launch of this new line of books, and White Dwarf especially would do tremendous work to really immerse readers and gamers in that connected universe. Characters from each of the first few books and stories were converted into Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, with full rules provided for using the likes of Drachenfels, Conrad, and the Plague Demon itself at the RPG table. And it didn't stop there. William King and Andy Warwick provided a scenario for Advanced HeroQuest that would allow you to play as Gotrek and Felix delving into the dungeon below Carrick 8 Peaks on an epic adventure. Next up came the novel Conrad, the first in a planned trilogy written by David Garnett under the pen name David Ferring. Apparently, though less well received by critics, Conrad was popular with younger readers, as it tells the story of a young boy from a small village far removed from the dangers of the Warhammer world who grows up to become one of the greatest mercenaries of the Empire. In fact, by the end of the GW Books line in 1991, of the 17 books published, 10 of them would be based in Warhammer Fantasy. Brian Craig would be able to complete his Orfeo trilogy with the release of Plague Demon, which initially seems to have been advertised as being called Yestereth, the name of the demon in question, and the final part of the trilogy, Storm Warriors. David Ferring would not be able to complete his Conrad trilogy, at least not under the GW Books label, as only the second part would get released, Shadowbreed. Jack Yeovil, meanwhile, would not write a Warhammer Fantasy trilogy, but did see a continuation of several characters from his Ignorant Armies and Drachenfels stories, particularly the ageless, formerly Bretonnian Lamian vampire Genevieve Dieudonne. Red Thirst was the third and final fantasy anthology from GW Books, which saw many of the writers from previous collections returning for more stories, and they were joined this time by Neil Jones, who had also signed on as assistant editor working with David Pringle. At the end of the 80s, there were 3 core game systems available from Games Workshop. Of course, we know Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000, but as well as those, however temporarily, there was also Dark Future. "You are free to go any time, Mr. Presley," said Sheba, "although we should like you to stay and enjoy our hospitality." He laid a scaly hand on the guitar, twanging a chord. Of course, if you would care to perform for us, it would be most appreciated. Elvis had played some strange shows before, back in the barroom and hootenanny days, but this would be the living end. The result of merging two aborted projects by Richard Halliwell and Mark Gascoigne, Dark Future was a miniatures game of vehicular combat in a post-apocalyptic American nightmare, a setting somewhere between the first Mad Max film and Judge Dredd's Cursed Earth. As it was receiving a considerable push from Games Workshop in 1988 and 89, it was also a universe that David Pringle was tasked with bringing to life through GW Books. And to do it, he had the perfect author, Kim Newman as Jack Yeovil. Kim Newman recalls that at the time he was able to write a 70,000 word final draft in just 4 weeks. So he would turn that mighty pen of his to a world of car-mounted guns and white line fever. The first Dark Future book was Route 666, an anthology named for the Yeovil short story anchoring the collection. That was followed by Demon Download, Crocodile Tears, and Comeback Tour, all written by Newman, with the latter telling the story of Elvis Presley who'd come out of hiding to become a new kind of road warrior. A fifth book in the Dark Future world would come from Brian Stableford under his Brian Craig pseudonym, Ghost Dancers. Recalling his work on the series, Newman has said that there was originally a broader plan for the Dark Future novels. Because the basics of the game were so thin, there was a lot of latitude to make stuff up, and David Pringle, Alex Stewart, Eugene Byrne, Brian Stableford, and I all filled in lots of things. It gets complex because I know Alex and Eugene wrote books that didn't come out in the Dark Future line. My original plan was for 2 trilogies, but 5 books. There would be 2 books about Sister Chantal, my Demon Download, and Eugene's finished but not published Violent Tendency, which we plotted together, and 2 books about Crocodile Tears, and Comeback Tour, with a final collaborative volume, United States Cavalry, in which the characters meet and all the plots are resolved. The Black Library has published a lot of books, and though I've not counted, I would be willing to bet that the vast majority of those are set in the 41st millennium. The story in 1990 couldn't be more different though. There would be 17 books in total in the whole GW Books line, and we now know that 10 of those were Warhammer Fantasy and 5 of those were Dark Future. That means that there would only be 2 Warhammer 40,000 books in the GW Books range. They scuttled like crabs. They burrowed like worms. They rolled balls of wire about like dung beetles. Jack suspected that their recycling and export trade had practically become instinctive. What did these know of the rest of the city, let alone of the planet or galaxy? As much as the mite on the bee's mouthparts knew about the rest of her body, or about the throbbing hive. As with Warhammer Fantasy, the first 40k book on the shelves was an anthology of short stories, written by a range of authors. Included were a collaboration between Brian Ansell and William King, the story that gave the collection its name, Deathwing. There was also a solo story written by King, and stories by Storm Constantine, Charles Stross, and Neil McIntosh. There were also 2 stories written by one Ian Watson. Although he had turned down the initial offer from David Langford, when he was approached by David Pringle, Ian Watson had a change of heart. Reflecting on that original approach, he remembers, "I would have this terrible ethico-political problem of writing for a volume to be called Warhammer. Had it only been called Peacefeather, time drifted by, till I realised that I rather urgently needed thousands of quid." And with his offer of thousands of quid in his hand, David Pringle was able to secure Ian Watson to write the first 40k novel. Remembering how he went about the process, Ian Watson has said, "I hallucinated myself into the 40k milieu and began to have enormous mad fun in broodingly, gothically, luridly going over the top. That's when it all gelled and the Inquisition War trilogy came about. The first full-fledged 40k book was Watson's Inquisitor, the story of Audio Malleus Inquisitor Jack Draco. The wild and arguably wonderful book would go on to be reprinted as Draco, and would ultimately receive 2 sequels, though not during the tenure of GW Books. Brian Craig's Dark Future novel Ghost Dancers and Jack Yeovil's Warhammer Fantasy book Beasts in Velvet would be the final fiction titles released under the GW Books label. But during the run there would also be a couple of art books published as well. The first was called Ratspike, a curated collection of art and miniatures photography by John Blanche and Ian Miller. The hardcover book is a genuine beauty, and it captures a small fraction of the incredible contributions to Games Workshop history that both artists have made. It's also nice to see the legacy of Ratspike living on, with a dog in Hexbane's Hunters presumably named for it. A second wonderful art book, Blood and Iron, was released showcasing the art of Les Edwards, the artist behind, amongst other things, the cover for HeroQuest. GW Books had been launched with a staff of 2 people, editor David Pringle and art editor Ian Miller, but it hadn't been long before Ian Miller had parted ways with the company. According to Pringle, Ian Miller only lasted a year or so. There was some sort of blazing row between him and Brian Ansell and Tom Kirby, but I don't know the full details, or I've managed to forget them. I just kept my head down and carried on editing books. So eventually, Ian left in a bad temper, and the guy he brought in as an assistant to us both also left. So by late 1989 or early 1990, I was in the Brighton office on my own. By 1991, GW Books and David Pringle were told to stop commissioning authors for new works. In fact, Pringle was left with basically no work to do all of that year. Instead, he just spent his time working on Interzone, because he had no books to edit. By the end of the year, GW Books was dead. Reflecting on the end, Pringle said, "I think it was largely to do with poor marketing, too high pricing, and insufficiently commercial covers. But behind it all, mainly, was the fact that GW just didn't know what they were doing when it came to marketing books. Even the large paperback format that the books had initially been published in had caused problems for the line. They just didn't fit onto commercial bookshelves. Retailer WH Smith's had refused to stock them, either because they didn't fit, or because they faced local competition from Games Workshop stores that were also selling the books." But that wasn't all. David Pringle added this: "I think there was some pulling 2 ways between Brian Ansell, who was all for the books, and Tom Kirby, who tended to be against them. Following the Kirby-led management buyout in 1991, Brian Ansell left the company and Kirby took the reins. Perhaps that too was a factor. All of the late 80s wildcards and experiments were ended. The record label, the RPG publisher, the books imprint. They were shut down and brought to an end. With GW Books having been shuttered, there was a period of silence on the battlefront that was Warhammer fiction. That would all change after almost a year, when Games Workshop would enter a deal with Boxtree, a publisher typically responsible for tie-in novels for the likes of Star Wars and Star Trek. The existing GW Books range would be reprinted in a smaller, cheaper format, with much of the art removed. Incomplete series like Conrad and Inquisitor would see their trilogies completed, and new books were commissioned like Ian Watson's Space Marine novel. Eventually, even the Boxtree deal would come to an end though. But that would be when Andy Jones finally found a pathway to the Black Library. But that's another story. The first story in the first GW book was Geheimnisnacht by William King, and it introduced the old world to a troll slayer and his human companion, Gotrek and Felix. Even though they never received a full novel during the GW Books era, these characters, perhaps the most famous and loved of all Games Workshop fiction even to this day, were literally the first thing in the history of GW Books. Speaking on the Combat Phase podcast in 2019, William King recalls, "One of the great charms of Warhammer is that there's a world there. You're not just pushing miniatures around on a table, you're actually telling stories. Each of these units has a personality, they mean something. And that's something that Games Workshop worked very hard to create, I think. The idea that there was a world there, that these units were what they were, part of a mythology, and that by participating in the game, you were taking part in that mythology as well." And I think he's right. There was a tremendous amount of work that Games Workshop put into this. Brian Ansell and David Pringle and Ian Miller and all of those talented authors really did prove that there was a world there. I'm sure it's the same for many of you. When I play Warhammer, I imagine the stories that are taking place. The characters that are in my army are in those stories and in that world. But when I'm not playing Warhammer, I still like to imagine that there is a persistent world there. And I can do that by reading stories that are set within it. For me, having authors create these wonderful characters and wonderful stories in that world helps to give it a certain level of reality is not the right word, but it makes it more tangible. It makes it something that I can partake in. It's a mythology that I can be part of, as William King says. And though it may well be an owned world, I think that there is still something worthwhile and rewarding in professional authors writing those stories. Though that universe and that world may belong to a corporation, it only exists in our imagination. So have I got 5 words for you, or at least 4.5. Jordan Sorcery's GW Books Club. I'm going to be reading all 17 of the original GW books in release order, 1 book a month, starting with Ignorant Armies in August. You can join in on my book club by reading along with me. Why not tweet or thread or Instagram your thoughts as we go? Or if you want, you can join my Patreon and come along to my monthly book chat. I'm going to be hosting on August 20th my first Ignorant Armies book chat. My Patreons can join me in a live stream and we're going to talk about the book and our reflections and our theories. No spoilers though, because here's my confession. I've not read most of these books. This is going to be my first time, so I'm super excited about it. You can also then, at the end of each month, watch a video here on the channel where me and my friend Stu from the Miniatures Realms YouTube channel will talk about the books. I will bring in the best thoughts and comments from my Patreon exclusive chats, as well as all of my reflections and theories and Stu's reflections and theories. And we're going to talk about that, talk about the trivia, talk about the context in which the book was released, talk about the stories themselves, what we think of them, and where we think things are going to go. I hope that you've enjoyed this history of GW books. If you did, please feel free to give it a like. And why not let me know what your favourite ever Games Workshop book is in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. I have drawn much of this history from an excellent article written by Stephen Baxter for Vector magazine in 2006. You can actually access that via the Wayback Machine, and I've included a link in the description below. It's a really fantastic series of interviews and first-hand accounts of what it was like to work for GW Books during this period. Definitely worth a look if you're interested in reading more. So, August is Ignorant Armies, the first book in the run. Very, very excited. I'm going to be putting a link to my website as well, where you can find out all of the information about the book club. It's going to be great. I'm really, really super excited about it. Honestly, I think this is going to be a fantastic experience. It's going to be a long one because there's 17 books, but I'm fully invested. I think it's going to be awesome. Thank you very much for watching. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. So, 17 books, 1 book a month, starting in August. That means we'll be finished in December 2024, which means that someone could gift me, for Christmas, the complete Black Library collection, and we'll never have to end, ever, 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 ever. Book club forever. Let's cross that bridge when we get to it.